Hi, everybody. Today's talk is going to be about how the pre-STAR template that the FDA released for pre-submissions has totally changed the way we're approaching new product development. May be a fairly bold statement. I mean, yes, we're still using design controls, and yes, we still have design reviews, but how are we changing the new product development process? We're changing it quite significantly, and it's at the very beginning of the process. It's going faster now and with more confidence. For example, at the very beginning of the project, people are like, well, what's the classification of the device? What's the regulatory pathway? How long is this going to take? Well, we're jumping in much faster now with pre submissions because now you're only able to do 4 topics during a pre-sub. In the past, we could upload um, a complete testing plan and get feedback on it. Now we can only ask questions on 4 topics. So if you can only ask about 4 topics, you can't ask about regulatory strategy and indication for use and biocompatibility and electrical safety and sterility. Oh, we're already at 5, and we haven't even gotten to some of the performance testing. So if you submit your entire testing plan and you have an electromedical device, you might have 11 different topics that you want to discuss with the FDA, and they're only letting you talk to 4 different specialists. So you have to think strategically, which ones do I want to talk with the FDA now about, and which ones do I want to talk about later? So you're actually going to probably have to automatically do 2 pre-subs for most submissions. Now, if you have a very solid idea of exactly what testing is going to be required because you have a very traditional device that's very similar to other devices on the market and you know what the testing requirements are going to be, then you might have very limited number of questions and you can do 1 pre-sub. I actually had a company request a meeting with me next week. I'm looking forward to meeting them. Never met them before. They're outside the country, but they have an IV device. It's going to be used in IV sets. And there are lots of IV products out there. There's over 100 codes that I can look at in General Hospital, and there are 4 of them alone that probably fit very closely with what this device does. So I won't have any trouble finding lots of very recent 510K predicates for this company. And there may be slight differences between their design and the indication for use for their product versus others, but I don't think they're going to introduce any new um, risks that the FDA would say, no, this is a de novo. So therefore, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to get that in writing from the FDA. We're going to go to the FDA and we're going to say, hey, we have this device. Here's a description of the device. We've done a little bit of research and we think this is the potential product code for this device. Does the FDA agree with this regulatory strategy? Yes or no? And if they don't, they could do one of 2 things. They could say, no, we think it belongs under this instead, or they might say, we think this needs a 513G. But that's going to be the first step, is going to be submitting a very early pre-sub for this company to nail down the regulatory strategy. And at the same time, we can ask other questions about, does the FDA agree that this would be the general testing plan? They're only going to be able to give general answers on that because we're not going to be able to provide protocols in 4 or 5 different areas because we can only ask about 4 topics. But we might ask about performance testing because sterility is going to be very straightforward. Biocompatibility is going to be very straightforward for this type of device. But the 2 tests that I would expect to be a little bit different are human factors. Might be very different because it's a somewhat novel device and you're going to set it up a little bit differently than other IV sets. And then the second area is going to be on the performance testing because they have a specific claim they're going to try to make, and we're going to have to demonstrate with some non-clinical benchtop data that they can meet that claim. So those are the 3 areas I'm expecting to focus on in that initial pre-sub. It would be the regulatory pathway, the performance testing, and the human factors. Those 3 areas. I don't know if we'll need anything else in terms of additional questions, so we might not need a second pre-sub, but we want to get those answers as early as we can in case we need to do a second pre-sub, because every pre-sub is going to take us probably about around 100 days. The FDA's process is 70 days to get you an email response and then 5 more days to get a teleconference. But we need a little bit of time to prepare the pre sub up front. And what I really love about the pre-sub is I can just export from the previous one and import it into a new one, or I can copy and paste and create a new one from the original version of the pre-sub, and I don't have to do a lot of typing over again. Very minor edits. So the timing of the pre-subs, there are going to be two of them in more complex novel devices and only one in devices that are not so novel, but we're probably going to be pushing those in earlier so we can get the confirmation on the regulatory strategy. Number two, um, with regard to content that you have to provide in a pre-submission, and a lot of companies are asking me, well, what do I need to provide? Same thing on an actual e-star for the FDA. The companies say, well, what content do we need to provide in the 510K? Well, now it's very clear that there's no arguing. A lot of times we'd say the RTA checklist requires this, you need to include this, and they wouldn't take it at face value, like the RTA checklist says this is what they mean. Now you can't even submit the e-star, you can't show it's complete until it turns green and you've attached a document there. So when we tell companies you need to split up all your software documentation into these 11 requirements, I can't even finish the e-star until I have a document attached to all 11 spots. So it's crystal clear to them these are not optional content, these are mandatory content, because I can't turn it from red to green until you give me something to attach here. So that's really helping. In the pre-subs, there was a lot of question. Well, do I need labeling? Do I not need labeling? They've made it clear. Gray means optional. Red means mandatory and it's not attached yet. Green means it's mandatory and you've attached it. When everything turns green, you're good. The gray things, don't worry about them, but you need to decide what questions you're asking. If you're asking a labeling question or you're asking human factors questions, you're going to need that labeling information so they can really look at, well, how is this device used step by step? So we understand what the steps, the critical tasks might be for this device. For the special controls, a lot of times we would spend maybe 1, 2, sometimes even 3 hours trying to verify, do we have a special controls guidance for this? Because it was difficult to search the FDA database for a special controls guidance. Sometimes it would be easy, sometimes it wouldn't be. If it was listed in the regulation, that made it easier. The pre-star has eliminated all that altogether. If you don't type things in the classification section, instead you use the drop downs. So first you'll select the review panel, then you'll select the regulation, and then you select the 3-letter product code for your device. It will automatically populate with any special controls guidance that apply. If nothing populates, there isn't a special controls guidance. Done. Don't worry about it. Now, if you have multiple codes, might have multiple that apply, and you have secondary codes, so you might have to take that into account. But that's really easy. All I have to do is change what the 3-letter code is and see if other ones pop up. So if I have 4 different codes, I just change it 4 different times and I see which ones pop up and I say, okay, now I know the 4 different ones. It's a validated template that's driven off the FDA database and it really helps me. Next thing related to the pre-stars, I was just reading the comments down below. um, a lot of companies are trying to figure out what do I need to provide to the FDA in terms of rationales for different things? How do I know if cybersecurity is required? How do I know if software documentation will be required? What the level of software requirements are? The eStar has really made that much more black and white for us. There's much less question in anybody's mind. Oh, yep. If I click on this box, it requires it. If I don't click on this box and I click on the alternate box, it doesn't populate. So I don't have to provide that item. But for regulatory strategy, it comes down to indication for use and technological characteristics. So if I've gone through the classification section and it's given me a special controls guidance, and I really know exactly what codes I'm working on here, I can go through that list of codes and try to find something with similar indications. In general, what we'll do is we'll ask one question about the indication for use if it's not identical. If it's identical, no questions to ask. And then the second question for regulatory strategy is going to be, how are we going to address the technological differences? And the FDA has in their substantial equivalence comparison document, here are the things that we want you to compare for technological characteristics. So one of them would be the materials that it's made out of. One of them would be the power source. So is it electric powered or not? Or is it manually powered by gravity? What is it? Another thing would be, um, what is the use environment for this device? So what are the technological characteristics of your device really change, um, potentially what predicate you might choose. But if you can't find a predicate, you might still be able to satisfy the FDA that we can find a reference device that would be suitable and justify the technological differences. They don't create new issues of risk. They're the same issues of risk. We just need to provide the right verification and validation testing to satisfy them. So when you're going through those technological differences, that's where you're going to ask regulatory strategy questions of, um, is it sufficient to use this predicate, even though we have these technological differences and do this testing? Or do we need to provide a reference device or a secondary predicate? Don't right off the bat say we want to use these five predicates. One predicate is plenty for a 510K. You don't need two, three, four, and five. Let the FDA tell you in a pre-sub that you need to add one and tell you why you need to add one before proposing to add one. If you know you have a technological difference, propose a reference device instead of a secondary predicate. Much simpler strategy. And the pre-sub is the place to get those answers. So ask the regulatory strategy questions early. If your indications are not exact, you need some discussion there. And then the second issue should be the technological characteristics. So we're really getting into these regulatory strategy questions much earlier, and we're doing it through the pre-star, and it's making it a very fast, efficient process. We're not putting a lot of time into it. Um, and then when we're thinking about overall strategy for the project, very early on the project, we want to say, well, what aspects of the testing plan are we likely to have questions on, and what aspects of the testing are we not likely to have questions on? Biocompatibility for an IV product, zero questions to ask. I know exactly what tests we're going to need to do. Sterility, no questions to ask. It's going to be very straightforward. There is no software, there is no electrical safety. So I've already nailed down four areas what's going to be important and what's not. But for other devices, it might not be so black and white. And so when you see at the very beginning planning stages that things are not going to be so black and white for a product, and it isn't going to be an obvious testing plan that there's no questions about, that's when you want to push up in your schedule, make it earlier, your pre-submission, because you're probably going to need to leave room for a second pre-submission meeting. Because the first one's going to take you probably around 100 days, and the second one's going to take you around 100 days. So you're looking at 200 days total to get through two pre-subs. And so if you know that you might need to have that second one, push that pre-sub up earlier in the schedule. And I would say that's the biggest fundamental difference. Instead of coming up with a long drawn out regulatory strategy document or regulatory pathway document, I would say just fill in a pre-star and have your first question or two questions be about regulatory strategy. That's it. That's your whole entire regulatory pathway. It's we're going to do a pre-stub and we're going to ask two questions, one about indication for use and one about the predicate strategy and technological differences. That's what we're going to do for the regulatory pathway right up front. And it's faster, it's more concise, it's giving us some early communication with the FDA, and it has some other benefits. One of the really cool benefits is now we have clients that are becoming much more familiar with the eStar templates because they used a pre-star. They know what the different color coding is. The red means I still need to attach something. Green means I'm good. Gray means it's an optional item. Another thing that they're learning is that they have to attach these documents as PDFs so they can see where they're going to have to attach things and how to separate the documents out. It's forcing our clients to use Adobe Acrobat and put everything in PDF formats a lot. um, because everything submitting to the FDA is going through that pre-STAR or E-STAR template. So those are some of the changes that we're seeing, and it's having a pretty big impact on how we plan our initial strategy at the very beginning before they actually start the testing. It's forcing us to start earlier, and it's being much more systematic about it. And systems are good; they usually make things run more smoothly and consistently. But I think it's also going faster. But we have to start earlier. So those are some of the differences. I hope that really helps you understand how we're using the pre-star a little bit differently now for pre-submissions and new product development. Um, Somebody had a question here. He said, I would have guessed that more predicates are better. That's usually what people think. They want to list a whole bunch of predicates. That's absolutely what you do not want to do. You will only want to list one predicate. Every single predicate you list, you have to show equivalence to. You only want to show equivalence to one, and more doesn't make it better. It more makes it more complicated. You have to compare more things for each device. Um, in the past, people would list multiple devices that are similar, thinking more is better, but the FDA only wants one. And so the best strategy is basically what you see in tables in very recent 510Ks. That SE comparison table in the 510K summary is here's the predicate, here's the subject device, and here's the justification for any differences. That's all you need to do. If there are technological differences that need to be addressed, a reference device might be needed, but don't volunteer it up front. Let the FDA say you need a reference device to address this. Um, if it's obvious you're going to need a reference device, for instance, the predicate you're choosing is not an OTC product and you're going for OTC, then you might need to do that. But that should be your pre-sub question to the FDA on regulatory strategy. Is it sufficient to use a reference device like this one and give them a number, or do we need to use some other strategy such as a secondary predicate? Very simple, and you'll get a very straight answer. And generally, the answer is less is more. I hope that helps everybody. If you have any additional comments, please put them below. And we will continue to be posting up some new things about pre-subs as we use this new pre-star more. But we're really liking this template. It's really speeding things along at the beginning of our projects. And we've actually changed our kickoff process. So I just spent some time writing some content and recording some videos for new clients. When you come on board, you can have a little surprise with here's a kickoff video, and you have a little bit of homework before you even get to the kickoff meeting. It's really important, but it compresses our development cycle, compresses your entire cycle to get to that pre-sub. So instead of 6 months to have your pre-sub meeting, we're trying to get this down to less than 100 days. Hope that helps, and looking forward to hearing comments down below. And if you have any suggestions for next week, let me know. Bye bye.